She marries a dying billionaire for his fortune, but when he miraculously recovers, she discovers the real reason he chose her. The grand Lancaster estate was bathed in golden light, the chandeliers sparkling like stars in the vast hall. The scent of fresh roses filled the air, but the atmosphere was anything but romantic. Guests, dressed in designer gowns and tailored suits, whispered behind their champagne glasses, exchanging looks of curiosity and disdain. At the altar stood Eleanor Gray, draped in an exquisite white gown worth more than what her family had earned in a lifetime. Her fingers clutched the bouquet tightly, but her expression remained impassive, cold. Theo Lancaster, her groom, sat in his sleek black wheelchair, dressed immaculately in a tailored suit. His pale face bore the marks of illness, yet his eyes, sharp, unreadable, studied her with unsettling intensity. A man cleared his throat. The lawyer, standing beside them, slid a thick document onto the table in front of Eleanor. "Miss Gray, please sign." Eleanor took the pen without hesitation, pressing it firmly against the paper. Each stroke of her signature felt like sealing a deal with the devil. She had no illusions about love. She was marrying a dying billionaire for his fortune, and he knew it. As soon as she lifted the pen, Theo spoke, his voice low but edged with amusement. "You're surprisingly efficient," he murmured. "Most women would at least pretend to hesitate before signing away their dignity." Eleanor met his gaze, unflinching. "And most men wouldn't willingly marry a woman who's waiting for them to die." A few guests gasped softly, but Theo only smirked. "Touche." The efficient, visibly uncomfortable, hurried through the vows. "Do you, Eleanor Gray, take Theodore Lancaster?" "I do," she cut in smoothly, not even bothering to look at Theo. There was a pause. The efficient turned to Theo. "And do you, Theodore Lancaster, take Eleanor Gray?" "I suppose I do," Theo said lazily. No one applauded. The wedding was over before it had even truly begun. Eleanor knew exactly what kind of marriage she was stepping into. She had spent most of her life barely surviving, watching her mother drown in debt, watching her little brother's health deteriorate without the money to get proper treatment. The Lancasters, on the other hand, had wealth that could last 1,000 lifetimes. And Theo? Theo was the dying king on his throne, playing his final game. She had done her research. Theo Lancaster was a brilliant businessman, ruthless in negotiations and feared in boardrooms. He had built an empire of luxury hotels and high-end real estate, but his body had betrayed him. Diagnosed with a rare terminal illness, he had only months left to live. So why had he chosen her? There were countless women who would have thrown themselves at the chance to be Mrs. Lancaster. Rich women, influential women, beautiful women. Yet, he had chosen Eleanor, a woman with nothing to her name but desperation and sharp wit. It didn't make sense. But she didn't care. She had what she wanted. His money. The wedding reception was suffocating. Eleanor could feel the weight of the judgmental stares from the Lancaster family, particularly from Henry Lancaster, Theo's younger brother. He was the opposite of Theo, charismatic, warm, but with a razor-sharp gaze that saw through everyone. "You must be very proud of yourself," Henry murmured as he approached Eleanor, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Eleanor smiled, unbothered, immensely. Beside him, Victoria Hale, Theo's former fiancée, didn't bother hiding her contempt. "Do you even have a soul, Eleanor?" Eleanor tilted her head. "If I did, it'd be worth significantly less than Theo's bank account." Victoria's nails dug into her glass. "You won't last here," she hissed. "You're nothing but a gold-digging parasite. The moment Theo is gone, you'll be thrown out like trash." Eleanor merely took a sip of champagne, unfazed. "Then I suppose I should start redecorating before that happens." Victoria stormed off, Henry watching her go with an amused smirk before turning back to Eleanor. "You're bold, I'll give you that," he said. Then, after a beat, he added, "But you should be careful. Theo may be sick, but he's not a fool." Eleanor's smile didn't waver. "Neither am I." Life at Lancaster Manor was exactly what Eleanor had expected, cold, hostile, and entirely transactional. The staff ignored her, the family despised her, and Theo was watching her. They barely interacted beyond necessary formalities, but Eleanor could feel his gaze on her constantly. He was testing her, waiting for something. One evening, as she walked past his study, she overheard his voice, low, serious, speaking to his doctor. "How much time?" Theo asked. A pause. "Less than we initially thought," the doctor admitted. "The deterioration is accelerating." Eleanor's fingers clenched around the doorframe. "Any other options?" Theo's voice was unreadable. "There's an experimental treatment, dangerous, low success rate, But it's a chance. Silence. Then, Theo chuckled darkly. I bet my new wife is already counting down the days until she inherits everything. Eleanor's stomach twisted, not from guilt, but from the realization that things weren't going to be as simple as she had thought. Theo Lancaster wasn't just a dying billionaire. He was a man with a plan. And Eleanor had just stepped into a game she didn't fully understand. The days after the wedding blurred into a monotonous routine. Eleanor played the role of the dutiful wife, attending to Theo's needs with a well-rehearsed grace. She sat beside him at dinner, helped adjust his blankets when he rested in the sunroom, and accompanied him to his medical appointments. To an outsider, she looked like a woman who cared. But in reality, she was waiting. Waiting for the inevitable. Waiting for the moment when Theo Lancaster, billionaire mogul, would finally take his last breath, and she could walk away richer than she had ever imagined. The house staff moved around Theo as if he were already a ghost, speaking in hushed voices, treating him with pity. But Eleanor knew better. Theo wasn't the type of man to surrender easily, even to death. She had expected his condition to worsen quickly, expected him to grow weaker, frailer. Instead, something unexpected happened. One evening, Dr. Whitmore, Theo's longtime physician, arrived at the estate with a strange energy about him. Eleanor stood outside the study as the doctor spoke in hushed but urgent tones. "There's been a breakthrough," Dr. Whitmore said. "A breakthrough." Theo's voice was skeptical. "A new surgical procedure," the doctor explained. "It's highly experimental, but it has shown promising results in patients with conditions like yours." Eleanor's breath caught. "What are the risks?" Theo asked flatly. "A high chance of complications. Only a handful of people have undergone it. But Theo, this is a real chance. If it works, you could live." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the doorframe. "Live? No. That wasn't supposed to happen." She had married Theo because she knew his days were numbered. If he lived, then her carefully constructed plan would collapse before her eyes. The next morning, Eleanor found Theo in his study, staring at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. His wheelchair sat beside him, but he was standing, gripping the edge of his desk for support. She hesitated in the doorway before speaking. "Dr. Whitmore says there's a chance." Theo exhaled sharply. "A small one, but a chance nonetheless." He turned his head slightly, studying her with that sharp, knowing gaze. "And what do you think?" Eleanor forced a neutral expression. "I think it's your decision." Theo chuckled, shaking his head. "That's not what I asked." Eleanor didn't answer. She didn't want him to go through with the procedure. But saying that out loud, that would be too honest. A silence stretched between them before Theo finally spoke again. "I'm going to do it." Eleanor's stomach twisted. Victoria and Henry reacted exactly as she expected, with shock and concern. "This is reckless," Victoria said, her voice tight with emotion. "Why take such a risk? What if you don't survive the surgery?" Henry added, "Theo, this isn't just about you. There's the company, the estate." "Precisely," Theo cut in smoothly. "And last I checked, a dead man can't run a business." Eleanor said nothing. She should have been relieved, should have acted like a supportive wife, pleased that her husband was choosing to fight for his life. But all she felt was unease. If Theo lived, what would that mean for her? The night before the surgery, Eleanor sat by Theo's bedside, watching the flickering light of the fireplace cast shadows across his face. He looked stronger than when they had first met, less like a dying man, more like the ruthless billionaire he had once been. He opened his eyes, couldn't sleep. "Neither could you," she countered. Theo smirked. "Fair enough." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the unspoken tension between them stretching thinner and thinner. Then, Theo broke it. "If I survive this," he said, his voice softer than usual, "what will you do?" Eleanor stiffened. She could lie. Could tell him that nothing would change, that she would remain by his side as his devoted wife. Instead, she whispered, "I'll leave." Theo didn't flinch. "I don't think so." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "You don't get to decide that." "No," Theo agreed, "but I do know you. And I know you won't walk away so easily." Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but he had already closed his eyes. Conversation over. The day of the surgery arrived, bringing with it a heavy tension that settled over Lancaster Manor, like a storm cloud. Eleanor stood outside the hospital, arms crossed, watching the rain drizzle against the glass windows. This should have been the end. Instead, it was a beginning. Hours passed. The surgery was longer than expected. The doctors came in and out, speaking in quiet, serious tones. Then, finally, Dr. Whitmore emerged. The surgery was a success, he announced. Theo was going to make it. Eleanor's breath caught. She had spent months preparing herself for his death, bracing for the day when she would inherit his wealth and walk away from this cold, loveless marriage. Now she was married to a man who was no longer dying. She felt the weight of his presence before she even saw him. Turning slowly, she saw Theo standing in the hallway, propped up on a cane but very much alive. His once pale complexion had regained some color, and though he looked exhausted, his sharp eyes locked onto hers with an unreadable expression. Disappointed. His voice was quiet, but the meaning behind it cut straight through her. Eleanor forced a smile. "Of course not. I'm your wife, aren't I?" Theo studied her for a long moment before his lips curled into a slow, knowing smirk. "Yes," he murmured, "you are." Eleanor turned away, but she could still feel his eyes on her, as if he could see right through her carefully constructed mask. She had married a dying billionaire. Now, he wasn't dying anymore. And for the first time since this marriage began, Eleanor wasn't sure who had really won this game. Theo Lancaster was no longer the frail, dying man Eleanor had married. His recovery was nothing short of miraculous. Where he had once been confined to a wheelchair, he now walked with purpose, his cane soon discarded. His face, once pale and gaunt, regained its sharp, commanding presence. And with his strength came something else. Power, control. A dangerous new intensity. Eleanor had prepared herself for grief, for widowhood, for inheriting a vast fortune, and walking away from the Lancaster name forever. Instead, she was now trapped in a marriage she no longer understood. Theo returned to his empire like a king reclaiming his throne. Board meetings resumed. Investors who had once anticipated his demise now scrambled to realign themselves. The world watched as the billionaire who had been on the brink of death rose from the ashes, stronger than before. But Eleanor, she felt like a pawn in a game she never realized she was playing. Because Theo was watching her, more than ever. His gaze was no longer tired or resigned, it was calculating, measuring, testing her. One evening, as they dined together in the grand Lancaster estate, Eleanor finally broke the silence. "You haven't asked me why I stayed." Theo took a slow sip of his wine, his lips curling into an unreadable smirk. "Would you have left if I had died?" Eleanor's grip on her fork tightened. "I don't know," she admitted. Theo leaned back, studying her. "You expected me to die, Eleanor." His voice was smooth, devoid of anger, just a quiet, unsettling amusement. "But now that I'm here, what happens next?" She held his gaze, refusing to let him see her unease. "That's up to you, isn't it?" Theo smiled. But there was something dangerous behind that smile. Indeed. Eleanor had always been curious why Theo had chosen her. She had been prepared for a logical reason. Perhaps he had wanted a wife without complications. Someone who wouldn't fight for control of his company. Someone who would simply wait for him to die. But she had never imagined there was something deeper. One evening, unable to shake her unease, Eleanor wandered into Theo's study. The room was impeccably organized, dark wood bookshelves lined with expensive volumes, the scent of aged paper lingering in the air. She had been in here before, always under Theo's watchful eye. But tonight he wasn't home. Her fingers traced along the desk, pausing on a locked drawer. She hesitated. Then, without giving herself time to rethink, she reached for a hairpin, slid it into the lock, and twisted. A soft click. The drawer slid open. Inside, among neatly arranged files and documents, lay an old, faded envelope. Eleanor's heart pounded as she unfolded the yellowed letter, her breath catching as she read the first line. "To my son, Theodore." It was a letter from Theo's father. Her eyes skimmed the words, her pulse growing unsteady. And then, she froze. Say, "There is something you should know about Eleanor Gray. Her mother, Margaret Gray, was once the love of my life." The room tilted. Eleanor gripped the desk to steady herself. Her mother. I loved Margaret deeply. But when I had to choose between my family's legacy and my heart, I chose the Lancaster name. I married someone else. I left her behind. A sharp ringing filled Eleanor's ears. Her hands shook as she read on. She was pregnant. I didn't know until years later. By then, it was too late. She had suffered, Eleanor had suffered. And all because of me. Eleanor's lungs forgot how to breathe. I do not expect forgiveness. But if there is one thing I regret in my life, it is abandoning them. The pain I caused them. At the bottom, written in Theo's own handwriting, was a final note. I found her, Father. I found Eleanor. Eleanor dropped the letter as if it had burned her. This wasn't a coincidence. This marriage, her marriage to Theo, wasn't just a cold business arrangement. It was deliberate. Theo had chosen her because of their parents' past, because of what his father had done to her mother, because of a debt that could never be repaid. Eleanor felt like the ground beneath her had vanished. The letter mocked her from where it lay on the desk. She had thought she understood Theo Lancaster, had thought he was a calculating billionaire who married her out of convenience. But now she realized she had never truly known him at all. The door creaked. She spun around. Theo stood in the doorway, his expression calm, composed, but his eyes told a different story. "You found it." His voice was quiet. Eleanor's pulse roared in her ears. "So it's true." Theo didn't deny it. He stepped forward slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I married you for a reason, Eleanor. But it wasn't the one you thought." Her breath came in uneven bursts. "You wanted to, what? Fix what your father did." Theo exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "I wanted to understand." "Understand?" Eleanor let out a bitter laugh. "Understand what, exactly? How it feels to manipulate someone into a marriage based on a secret they didn't even know." Theo studied her for a long moment. "I never lied to you." She wanted to scream, wanted to throw the letter at him and demand answers. But she didn't, because deep down she knew the truth was even more complicated than this letter. Theo Lancaster wasn't just some cold-hearted billionaire seeking redemption. And he wasn't just some ruthless businessman playing a calculated game. He had chosen her, not just because of their past, but because of who she was. And Eleanor? She wasn't sure if she hated him for it, or if, for the first time since she had walked into this marriage, she was starting to understand him too. Eleanor had made up her mind. She had spent days, weeks, trying to make sense of everything, but there was only one conclusion. She needed to leave. The contract that had once bound her to Theo no longer mattered. She didn't want his money anymore. She didn't want to be part of this twisted game of guilt, legacy, and obligations. So one evening, as Theo sat in his study, reviewing documents by the dim glow of his desk lamp, Eleanor walked in. He didn't look up at first, flipping through the pages in front of him. "You've been avoiding me." Eleanor exhaled sharply. "We need to talk." At that, Theo set his pen down, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were sharp, calculating as always, but there was something else, something he hadn't let her see before. "You found the letter," he said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "Yes." Theo leaned back in his chair, waiting. "And?" Eleanor swallowed. This was it. "The contract we signed, it doesn't matter anymore. I don't want your money, Theo. I don't want any of it." Silence. Then, Theo's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. "You think you can just walk away?" Eleanor's nails dug into her palms. "I can, and I will." Theo stood. He had fully regained his strength, no longer the dying man she had once married. He moved toward her with deliberate, measured steps until he was close enough that she could feel the heat of his presence. "You think I'll let you go?" he murmured, tilting his head. "Now of all times." Eleanor's breath hitched. This marriage was a lie. Theo's expression darkened, but his voice remained calm. "Was it?" She faltered, but only for a moment. "You married me because of your father's guilt, Theo. Not because of me." Theo studied her for a long moment before saying, very deliberately, "That's what you think." She clenched her jaw. "That's what I know." Theo exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Then suddenly he let out a quiet laugh. Eleanor's heart pounded. "What's so funny?" she snapped. Theo's smile faded as he stepped even closer. "You really think I'd let you go, Eleanor? After everything?" She glared at him. "You don't own me." "No," Theo admitted, "but you're mine, whether you want to be or not." Eleanor's pulse roared in her ears. She should have hated him for saying that. She should have turned and walked away. But for the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to. The days that followed were a war neither of them acknowledged. Eleanor remained in the Lancaster estate, though she told herself it was only temporary. She had packed her bags, had even stood by the door, ready to leave, but something had held her back. And Theo. He didn't try to stop her. Not with words. But he watched her. Every stolen glance across the dining table. Every moment when their hands almost brushed. Every time he found some excuse to be near her, to challenge her, to remind her that whatever this was between them, it wasn't over. One night, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep. She wandered into the library, expecting to be alone, only to find Theo already there. He was seated in one of the armchairs, nursing a glass of whiskey, watching the flames flicker in the fireplace. He didn't turn when she entered, but she knew he had sensed her. "You never did leave," he murmured. Eleanor crossed her arms. "Maybe I just haven't figured out the best way to make my escape yet." Theo chuckled, setting his glass down. "You keep telling yourself that." She frowned. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" He finally turned to face her. "Enjoying what?" This power game," she said. "Keeping me here, making me question everything." Theo's gaze darkened, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter, but heavier. "I'm not playing games, Eleanor." Something in the way he said it made her stomach twist. She had expected Theo Lancaster to be cold and ruthless, just like when they first met. She hadn't expected him to look at her like this. Like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. Eleanor's fingers trembled at her sides. She needed to leave. She had to leave. But instead, she stepped closer. And so did he. The fire crackled between them, but it wasn't nearly as hot as the tension in the air. Theo studied her face, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he spoke. "I chose you because of my father," he admitted. "Because of the mistakes he made." Eleanor swallowed hard. She already knew this. "But," Theo continued, "I kept you because of me." Eleanor's breath caught. "Theo, you think this marriage was just a transaction," he said, voice rougher now. "And maybe in the beginning it was." He reached for her then, his fingers brushing her wrist, sending a shiver through her skin. "But that's not what it is anymore." She should have pulled away. But she didn't. "Eleanor," Theo murmured, his thumb tracing small circles against her skin, "you are the only thing that makes me feel alive." Her throat went dry. She could see it now, the raw honesty in his eyes, the vulnerability he had never shown before. Theo Lancaster had spent his whole life controlling everything. But in this moment, he wasn't in control anymore. Neither of them were. Eleanor's lips parted, but she had no words. Because for the first time since this marriage began, money, power, and revenge no longer mattered. For the first time. It was real. Eleanor stood by the window of her room, staring at the Lancaster estate grounds. The morning sun bathed the gardens in a golden glow, and for the first time since she had stepped into this house, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't trapped here. She could leave. There was nothing binding her anymore, no contract, no need for money. She had gotten everything she thought she wanted. But the thought of walking away from Theo? It hurt more than she was willing to admit. She could hear his voice from the hallway, speaking to someone on the phone. The deep timbre, the quiet authority, the man who had once been on the brink of death was now fully alive again. And somehow, so was she. But if she stayed, it wouldn't be because she had no other choice. It would be because she loved him. That realization settled over her like a weight she wasn't ready to carry. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to consider the alternative. She could walk away. Start over. Find freedom. But the idea of a life without Theo in it felt empty. And Eleanor Gray had never feared anything more than emptiness. The decision should have been hers alone. But fate had other plans. As Eleanor descended the grand staircase, Victoria Hale was waiting for her. The woman who had once been Theo's fiancée was dressed in an elegant black coat, her sharp blue eyes filled with calculated determination. "You don't belong here," Victoria said without pretense. Eleanor sighed. "We're really doing this." Victoria took a step closer. "Theo was mine before you, and he will be mine again." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "That's interesting, because I don't see him running back to you." Victoria's lips curled into a smirk. "He doesn't have to. You'll leave on your own." Eleanor tilted her head. "And why would I do that?" "Because you're not like us," Victoria said smoothly. "You don't belong in this world. You were nothing before Theo, and you'll be nothing after him." Eleanor's blood ran cold. For most of her life she had believed that, had let the weight of her past define her worth. But now she was done being underestimated. Lifting her chin, Eleanor stepped forward until she was just inches from Victoria. "You're wrong," she said quietly. "I may not have been born into this world, but that doesn't mean I don't belong in it." Victoria scoffed. "Then prove it. Walk away. If you really love Theo, let him go. Let him be with someone who can give him the life he deserves." Eleanor's chest tightened. But then, a familiar voice interrupted them. "You're awfully confident about what I deserve, Victoria." Both women turned. Theo stood at the bottom of the staircase, his expression unreadable. But his eyes, they were locked on Eleanor. I think I can decide that for myself, he added. Victoria's face paled. Theo. Go home, Victoria, he said simply. For a moment, Victoria hesitated. Then, with a tight nod, she turned and strode toward the door, heels clicking against the marble floor. As the grand doors closed behind her, Theo turned to Eleanor, and everything else faded away. Theo crossed the space between them in a few slow steps, stopping just close enough that Eleanor could feel the warmth of his presence. You were going to leave, he murmured. Eleanor swallowed. I thought about it. Theo's gaze searched hers. And? She took a deep breath. And then I realized something. Theo waited. Eleanor lifted her chin, finally letting the truth escape her lips. I didn't stay because of money, she admitted, or because of a contract, or even because of guilt. Theo exhaled sharply. Then why? Because I love you. The words felt like both a surrender and a victory. For a moment, Theo just stared at her, as if trying to memorize the way she looked in this exact second. Then, slowly, carefully, he reached out and cupped her face, his touch achingly gentle. You have no idea how long I've waited to hear you say that, he murmured. Eleanor's breath caught as his thumb brushed her cheek. So what happens now? Theo's lips curled into a small, almost relieved smile. Now? He echoed. Now we start over. No contracts, no expectations, just us. Eleanor hesitated. And if I fall out of love with you? Theo smirked. Then I'll just have to make sure you never do. She laughed softly. You really think you can keep me forever? His expression softened. I don't need forever, Eleanor. He leaned in, his lips a whisper away from hers. I just need you to stay today. Eleanor smiled. Then I guess I'll stay. And as Theo finally closed the distance between them, pressing his lips to hers, Eleanor realized. She hadn't lost this game. She had won the only thing that ever truly mattered. Love. And so, Eleanor and Theo's story wasn't one of contracts or convenience. It was one of fate, redemption, and an unexpected love that neither of them had planned for. She had entered this marriage for money, expecting nothing more than a cold transaction. But in the end, she had found something far more valuable, a love that challenged her, changed her, and made her believe in something real. And Theo. He had spent his life controlling everything, calculating every move. But with Eleanor, he had found the one thing he could never control, his own heart. Their love story wasn't perfect. It was messy, complicated, built on a foundation of secrets and mistakes. But in the end, it was real. And sometimes, that's all that matters. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more tales of love, resilience, and the unexpected twists of fate. Because sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones we never see coming.